What impacts your life experience more than anything else is the story you tell about it, because your story becomes your reality. Now, it's unlikely that this idea is completely new to you, but I found that this is one of those areas where nuances are missed, it's often taken at surface value, and this powerful medicine can even become the poison. So in this episode, we'll be taking a brilliant human look at why your story becomes your reality, why a bad story is really bad, why a good story is really good, and why what looks like a good story can sometimes be a bad story. Plus, I'll be looking at how to find a story that truly works for you. That's one that serves you, empowers you, and is neither cloud cuckoo spiritual bullshit or fear-laden limitation. This is going to be an amazing episode. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. If you're looking to improve your life, to heal, to grow, and mature as an individual, but maybe you found that some of the personal development and consciousness stuff has given you the impression that you need to be super serious and vigilant to get anywhere meaningful, or feeling like maybe you're just not up to snuff, well, this show is here to remind you of your humanity, and in fact that's where your true joy and brilliance lies. With over 25 years of experience in the transformation biz and having developed MPA, one of the world's simplest, pressure-free approaches to growth and well-being, if I do say so myself, I'll be sharing tips, steps, and insights that'll help you navigate all the aspects of life as a growth-seeking being. On this show, it comes to you with a good dose of humour, maybe a smattering of colourful language, a reminder not to take things so personally, and most importantly, to be kind to yourself along the way. Make sure you hit that follow button, and let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. I'm delighted that you're here. We are at episode number 109. Which means if you want to see the show notes for today, you can go to www.beabrillianthuman.com/109 and find the show notes there. It also means 108 previous episodes for you to binge watch if you're new here. Lots of fantastic content to consume and change your life. And I'm in good spirits. I'm almost feeling the Christmas thing. I know it's the 30th of November as I record this, coming into December tomorrow, and I'm normally a bit of a bar humbug when it comes to early Christmas. But there's some big things happening in my life, and I'm rather excited. I may tell you about them. Otherwise, I'll leave you hanging. Well, I'm glad you're here. We're talking about Christmas. There's the Christmas narrative. I may do something on that as well. I'm putting lots of maybes out there, aren't I, today? But stories are amazing. They are the thing that makes a huge difference in our life. Many of the things with MPA, by the way, if you're new here, you're going, what's MPA? MPA stands for non-personal awareness. And I often say it starts with a six-line simple spoken word process that helps you stop taking things personally. That's a story about it. I also say it's a philosophy, which it is. There's lots of philosophies, which in a way are other stories. And a lot of what I do in my work is helping people shift their perspective, which is another way of saying change the story about what's going on. And the thing is, when you change your story, then there's a way that your reality comes about to reflect that, because we're all translating energy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Today, in this episode, I think it is going to be a really important episode that I put out. I can't believe there are a couple of episodes which I'll put in the related episodes in the show notes, which again, www.beabrillianthuman.com/109 for today. I did one on what motivates you, which in a way talked a little bit about the stories. And then there was one that was about, I think it was called, off the top of my head, They're So Negative. And that's about, how you label other people's experience, and how you label their experience affects your experience of the situation. So we're going to go a bit deeper with that today. So we're going to talk about, what is the story? What are the situations or the places where it's really good, especially in terms of, your personal evolution, to look at the stories you tell yourself. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the story itself impacts your experience. And then we're going to get into some practical stuff because I think the important thing, the distinction here is that, as I said in the intro, Oftentimes this idea of, just tell a different story doesn't go into what it looks like to find a genuinely good one, because it's not always so black and white as to what that is. It's not just about kind of slapping the smiley face over the empty fuel tank, as Abraham Hicks would say, if you recognize the reference. And so I'm going to talk about it in those terms, give you an idea of how you can go about finding a perfect story in every situation. Let's do this. So let's start off with a little bit about, how your story impacts your experience, why your story becomes your reality. Well, we have to take a bit of a step back and talk about stories themselves. I mean, stories are living, breathing things. And if you stop and think about it, it's the stories in our lives, in our personal lives, in our society, in our history, that shape how we respond and behave and think about all sorts of different things. History is a good example. There's that saying that, the winner writes the history. You could say the winner translates the Bible, or whatever the religious book is that gets translated. And then from that, people subscribe and buy into it. And that becomes a bedrock of how they behave or how they set up their society. And that's on a big global scale, but on a very personal level, that's exactly what we do in our own lives. We tell a story about something. That story becomes a truth for us, and then from there's different responses. But at its heart, I could say that all we really have is the stories that we tell, because we live in an energetic world. Everything fundamentally is just swirling waves of energy and little vortices hanging around, and from it there's a mechanism that we have, this translation mechanism, which gives us our perspective, our perception of things, and then our brain translates it into this experience that we have. But fundamentally it's just energy, and the stories that we tell about it really are the meanings that we give to things, because stories, if you think about it, always embed some kind of meaning. And when you put a meaning onto something, it's sort of, over time, it becomes a belief. And those beliefs and meanings are like filters. They filter how we perceive this massive information that comes into us. And that's going to affect what we experience in the world. There's a very famous NLP sort of, I guess it's a demonstration. It's a demonstration of the power of the mind to delete things. It's how filters works. And I'm sorry if I'm about to spoil it for any of you who've never done NLP and are going to sit in a seminar where they're trying to sell you or introduce you to NLP. But what they do is they say, look around the room and I want you to find everything that is blue. So count the number of blue things that you can see in a room. Now, you can do this now at home. Just look around and see if you can count the number of blue things that you can see. Just look for blue. That's anything you're interested in is blue. So have a look around. And then the next question is, so how many red things did you see? Now, you might then look around and cheat and have a look for the red things, but in that moment, you were not noticing the red things, because the story was look for blue. And in look for blue, you delete the red because it's not of interest. And that's kind of the fundamental way that stories, it's not as, red and blue as that, but it's fundamentally the mechanism that means that when we have a story about something, we tend to skew our experience, the things that we look for, based on the story we tell about it. And then that experience and those meanings are the sort of foundation of our emotion. How we feel about things are determined by that. I mean, and then from our emotion, obviously action and behavior comes from it. I mean, literally the mechanism for it is you get your translation, your meaning, the brain interprets it, and then there's a whole series of events that work physiologically, literally chemicals far off in the brain, depending on the meaning, the nuance, the flavor that you give a story, and that impacts the body. So if you think a happy thought, you have a happy chemical, it's called a neuropeptide or happy neuropeptide. And generally the body will respond by assuming a happy posture or some kind of happy physiology. If you have a depressed thought, then, a depressed neuropeptide gets fired off. It sort of has receptors in all the cells around the body, and you tend to go into more of a depressed state. That's what the physiology does. So these stories that we have can impact our health. That's why someone in the workplace can be extremely stressed by it, and someone in the workplace in the same situation could be very okay with it. Now, here's a good point to put a caveat in. I'm not saying that, well, then if you're stressed in the workplace, you're just bad at your stories. That's not what I'm saying here, folks, because it's not quite that cut and dry. Because it may be that the reason that you'll feel stressed there is it's just not a fit for you. Whereas if it is generally a fit for you, you could have a fit for you, but you're just making yourself have a hard time of it because you've got some crappy stories that just don't work for you. So think of the nuances. So how do we know, what is the story? What is the truth? What is the ultimate? What is the meaning of life? 42, Joel. That's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference there. How do we know? What's the truth? Well, the answer is we don't know. We have no idea, because all we've got is our unique translations of reality. We have agreed constructs of language and that kind of thing. But fundamentally, we haven't got a clue. There's no definitive story. And over history, it's been proven that we get a definitive story which lasts for a while. And then the story evolves and we have a new story, and that becomes the sort of bedrock of foundation of the reality of any particular society over time. There was a time when it was considered, highly appropriate to sacrifice other human beings to the gods in order to ensure that you had a good crop. That was just a basic societal story. It was reality. It was fact. There were people who have wars over the truth of that, and nowadays that isn't really how we think about things. We understand you need to sort of work with the soil, and and there's a whole different story around farming. I don't know what it is today, but it's different. And we may come to find, in fact, you may notice with our climate and everything else at the moment, or at least the sustainability of us humans living on the planet, that some of our stories about what good farming is may be up for review, shall we say, because there's impacts of them being shown across the land and throughout the world. So the thing is, we're going to have a story, and one of my favourite sayings, and if you've been around me much or listened to this much, I may have said it before on the podcast, I don't recall. I've certainly said it in a lot of my seminars and group work, but if you're going to have a story, have a good one, because we don't know anyway. All we really have is our story of the world. And what I mean by a good one is a story that works for you, because it isn't just a black and white thing. I did mention briefly before, it's like one of the ways that I see this idea that your story creates your reality. There's a number of, let's put it this way, I would say twisted, bit of a strong word, but twisted ways that idea, the story told about that idea. For example, like I just said, so if you're stressed at work, I've just said, the difference between two people, one that's stressed, one is not, is that one is telling a better story about it. But that misses the point, as I just made, that one of them, the reason they may be stressed is because it really doesn't work for them, and it's more of a signal to move them out. So that idea that your story creates your reality, I've seen it used in the personal development and spirituality world way as a torture booking mechanism. A rule of judgment, a stick to beat yourself up with, or to be beaten up with by your peers because you're telling a bad story. I'm not saying that today. And I've also seen it used in that kind of rote positivity way where, you become the sort of positivity police. And if someone says something negative, then, or what they consider to be negative, let's face it, then, again, they're beaten up by the positivity. And that's where you get into the realm of divorcing yourself from a connected reality. Because to me, that's the missing piece in this whole idea of, your story, your narrative creates your reality. If you're going to find a good story, it needs to be connected to you. It needs to be congruent. It needs to be real, because that whole sort of, I think I referred to it as, positive bullshit. I think that's a simple way to say it. It's like, it's where you're trying to say, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Sorry. Welcome to the Brilliant Human Show, where we start a sentence and can't finish it. But you get the idea. It's like when you try and be super positive, but some part of you knows it's not congruent, it's not true. You're just trying to sort of, again, as I said, slap that happy smiley face over the empty tank. No, the tank's empty. this isn't about sort of trying to deny what's there, but there's two stories where the tank is empty. The tank is empty. Oh my God, we're all going to die. Or the tank is empty. How can I best find my way to the fuel station? Or I'm really glad I've got a gauge on there so I know ahead of time that, I'm about to run out of fuel so I can do something about it. Or there's a story about an empty tank, not a good one, which is, you idiot, you should have put some fuel in there. That probably isn't helpful. So you see what I mean? It's not about shifting the reality. It's about finding a story within it that's going to help you, and it has to be connected to what's there. At least that's what I found to be the best blend of the idea that, your story creates your reality. So where do we have narratives around life? I mean, because obviously we have a story about everything. But in terms of how is this going to impact your life listening to this podcast? I mean, I think the main areas that where we can become conscious and mindful and wise about the story that we tell ourselves. Firstly, there's the story we tell about a situation. So I just described the empty fuel tank. That's a situation. So that's one area where you can examine, how your story is impacting your behavior. So again, it's that case of, if there's a situation and you are feeling stressed or depressed or down, one way to look at that is, how can I tell a different story about the situation? And we'll get into how to find one that's truly connected. But that's where you can examine, is it the story that is really causing the stress in some way? Or is it the situation itself? And that's where I mentioned, stress at work. Because sometimes the connected story is that I need to leave, for example. That's a very empowering story in a situation where it really isn't serving you at all. So it's that blend of, what is the situation, what's the story I'm telling about it, and where are the factors that are causing me stress. But it's one of those times where so many areas in life where we'll sort of apply a generally unhelpful story to a lot of different situations and don't get conscious and mindful about what the story is that we're telling. And really, it's an act of self-care when you look at the stories that you tell, the narrative you have. I mean, all the spin doctors in the political world know this all too well. If they can spin the narrative, it's going to impact the masses. It's going to impact the vote. It's going to impact the popularity of the politician. They know this all too well, but you can have that power in your life. In fact, that's where it most belongs. It's the most empowering act is when you begin to control your own narrative. And control is not a word that I use very often because, spoiler alert, fundamentally we don't have any. I don't mean that in a disempowering way. That's a very deep conversation about the nature of reality. But at the point of our human contact, at the point of our human experience, which is what this show is about, it is a sense of, taking control of it means taking power into your life around the stories that you tell. Another area is the stories or the narrative about who you are. Now, we have a lot of narrative going on about being unworthy, not good enough, something's wrong with us, all of these kind of different stories that we have. And it's an area where you can really make great strides if you start to consciously tell stories about yourself that are powerful, empowering, and congruent. A lot of these episodes and a lot of what I say in my sort of offerings to people includes start where you are. That's part of the congruency, is start with some truth that is better than some story that you're telling about yourself, which is completely limiting you and disempowering you. And the other area, which is a bit like situations, is the stories that we tell about other people. Now, this is the area that I covered in particular in episode 7, which I will link in the show notes, www.beabrillianthuman.com/109 for today. I'll link that one in there, because often we label other people and we get that. A label is a form of a story, really. It's just a very compact story. But again, when you label something or have a story about someone else, the way you experience them is going to be impacted by that. It's going to impact you, and in that can be very hurtful to you because of your story more than the reality. It can close you off from communication, which may be a way through the story, all sorts of things. But those are the three main areas I want to look at, which is a story. What's your story about a situation? What's your story about who you are? And what's your story about other people that are around you? Now, there are all sorts of levels of complexity to stories, the stories you tell, the narrative you tell. If I boil it down to a very 2D, sort of fairly polarized idea of it, which again, you'll know I'm not a fan of, but again, this is where context is important. For the purposes of teaching or illustrating, it can be useful. That's where it is useful. I tell you, if you break it down to two kinds of story, it's a bit like saying, happy or sad. I think that the most useful ones to be aware of is, on the downside, is the victim story. So many stories in a situation about who you are and about other people are designed to make you the victim of the story, to become a victim. Now, being a victim is a very powerless state, but there's lots of stories. So this, in terms of moving forward and looking at what's your story doing, is it making you a victim is a really good sort of test in some way. And then the opposite side of that in this context would be empowered. A story which empowers you, a story which puts you again in control of or at choice with, which allows you to honor your sense of power and responsibility in the situation. Those are the kind of stories that are much more likely to reap the rewards that you say you want when you paint a victim story. All right, so let's look at finding a story that works for you. So I suppose the meta step here is, before you start trying to change a story or examine your stories, I guess the first step is you have to acknowledge that you're telling a story. You're telling yourself a story about something. You kind of have to step into this idea, this story, funnily enough, that your experience is based on the stories that you tell yourself. Now, once you really, because there's this interesting thing that happens when people go, oh, yeah, I know that, yeah, of course we tell a story, but that's kind of just sort of not really touching barely the surface of this idea. When you really, really kind of sink into it, that my reality really is based on, or what I experience of this reality is based on the stories that I'm telling myself. If you let it sink in, already you're in a much more empowered state. Already you are, stepping out of the just sort of being the puppeteer of somebody else's story. So once you've acknowledged that you're telling yourself a story, then in any situation where you're not feeling great, you can ask, is it the story? Is the story that I'm telling myself working for me? So that bit inevitably brings you to ask the question, what is the story that I'm telling myself here? What am I saying about this situation? In MPA, the MPA process starts with what we call a spew. That's a chance just to tell your story without any judgment. But at least you get to see what it is when you stop trying to sort of edit yourself because it doesn't fit some, personal development or spiritual ideal, perhaps. But once you can honor that you have a story, start working out what that story is, then that's the question. Is the story working for me? So good tests for that is like, how does it make you feel? When you tell yourself that story, how does that make you feel? How do you react in the face of that story? How do others react to your story? Now, here's an interesting one. How do others react? Often you get a lot of peer support for really crappy stories. Oh, yes, you are a victim. Oh, you're terribly hard done by. You'll get a lot of peer support for those stories. As a society, we're kind of hooked on a lot of really crappy victim stories. But what I mean by how do other people react to your story, it's like our relational interactions are very much determined by the stories we have about each other in those situations. So you'll often get pretty instant feedback if you've got a crappy story, certainly with somebody else, by the way they react. Because again, remember, it's like receiving the energy that we're translating, but we're also admitting it based on our stories. So check in with the energy of the story to check if it's working for you. How is it working? And then, if it's not great or it's worse than that, then consider finding a better one. So to build a better story, and by the way, as we go through this, I want to, again, really presence this idea that It's not about trying to create some cloud cuckoo story. That's going to be unsustainable. It's not going to work. You're not going to buy it. You've got to be able to buy the better story that you build. But the way you do it, without going into like a full day course with you here, to put it simply, you've got to feel it out. You've got to be willing to sort of try other stories, check in with yourself and find the resonances that feel better. And in the same way, you'll be looking for, is this congruent? Because a really fantastic Disney-like story around your life, if it's not congruent, you're going to get that kind of that somewhere inside of you, you're going to wince or resist it in some way. So that's the path you've got to kind of weave, is finding, as I look for a better story, is it really congruent with me? And does it resonate in a way that feels better than the old one? And you don't have to find like the ultimate story straight away. You can take it step by step. It's easy to do it that way. Just a little bit better can make a huge difference, because what it does is it takes you from sort of a downward spiral to an upward spiral, and you can find better and better stories as you go along. Another good check question here is, does this story serve me? Now that's really good, especially if you're in a situation where you're telling a big old victim story. You have to ask, does this serve me? So I've got an example of this. So I think it's a couple of years ago now. One of the people that I've trained to do some of my work under a specific contract, I found out that they were basically being fraudulent in the use of my intellectual property. They pretty much broke the boundaries. They lied on various reports, which affected how much I got paid on the back of it. And I started out going into, a victim story. How dare they? Why is this happening to me again? Those kind of stories, and which put me in kind of this sort of fight/collapse mode, because I'd fight a bit and then I'd collapse. These were all signals to me that I was in a story that was not serving me. This was not serving me. So I actually literally did some conscious story work around it. And what I found out was that happened just after I'd come out of an abusive relationship, basically. It was a thing on which I based Boundary Bootcamp, which I'll link in the show, and it was about boundaries. And I'd really, through that period of my life, had got to the point where I had abuse in my childhood. It was like a life's work for me to sort of deal with different aspects of abuse in different forms. And at the back of that particular relationship, that was a personal relationship, I felt like something had clicked at a much deeper level, and I sort of felt really healthy and free. And then this sort of work-related sort of fraudulent lies, bullshit response happened. And I was like, oh my God, what? But the story that I found was that actually I'd been working with that person for quite some years, and this had been ongoing. And so the story I found, which felt congruent and actually served me, was that this was a consequential detox for me doing the work in that personal relationship, really getting to grips with boundary issues from it. One of the great things out of that was creating Boundary Bootcamp, understanding the nature of narcissism, the nature of manipulation, and how I'd been hooked into all of that wonderful stuff, which again you can get in Boundary Bootcamp. That's an amazing program. If you have boundary issues, then it's an amazing program for discovering how to build boundaries. So I went from a real victim story, it's happening again, to wow, this is really cool, because it's actually positive evidence that I am detoxing, getting rid of the things that were hidden before in relation to boundary issues are showing up because I'm available to sort them out. So I was much more sober when I dealt with it. There were way less ruffles in my feathers, and I was able to see it in a way that inspired me to tighten up my business boundaries, take some responsibility for my part in it, but not in a kind of a just back out of the fight kind of a way, and as well as as was happening in my personal life. And again, out of that came the Boundary Bootcamp program. So that was where I had to sort of really sort of have a conversation with myself. So the story that I'm telling myself does not serve me. And that's a good check. It didn't serve me. And then when I found a better one, that really began to serve me. And it's spurred on all sorts of very positive changes in my work life since then. Very powerful story. Another good check question that I want to give you is one that I got from Byron Katie. I love Byron Katie and the work of Byron Katie. If you haven't checked her out, make sure you go and do that. She also does a very simple approach, and it really is about the story. It's looking at what's the story. And one of her kind of check questions, which I love, is, does it bring me peace or stress? That's a really good question to ask yourself. Does this story bring me peace or stress? And frankly, if it brings you stress, you probably want to be looking for a better one. And I do want to say something though about this is, I want to reiterate, it's not just but positive bullshit. It's about finding an authentic story that feels better and works for you. But it's also not about using this new story as a pacifier. Now, this is where, as I said in the intro, what sounds like a really good story can be a really bad story. Because a pacifying story, in some ways, is, well, not some ways, it just frankly is, in my opinion, worse than a, in quotes, real story. A pacifier story is one which is basically a suppression technique. It uses minimization, it sort of seeks to avoid, it can be a function of neglect, self-neglect in a way, or just a sort of tendency to passivity. So a pacifying story is like saying something's okay when it's not. Which brings me back to Boundary Bootcamp. Most of the people who come to Boundary Bootcamp watch that video on the page, which I should say is www.thempaacademy.com/Boundary Bootcamp. And the video on that page, it says, are you okay with that? Because one of the biggest boundary red flags is saying you're okay with something when it's not. That's telling a story, which sounds like a good story. Yeah, I'm fine, I'm strong. They sound like good stories, but they can be horrifically toxic. So yeah, it's not about using your in quotes better story as a pacifier, because a lot of the time having a better story can enliven you. It's something where and it's not about completely reducing conflict, or even though I've used the peace or stress example, reducing stress. It's like that congruency will tell you. The congruency may be where you might have previously used a pacifying story is you need to stand up for yourself. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. How do I know? How does that feel better? Because it terrifies the bejesus out of me. Well, you could still be, terrify the bejesus out of you. And yet somewhere inside, if you tune in, there'll be this sense of relief, this sense of energy where there's been stagnation. Now, those things are better feelings, and it might take a stronger story to allow you or to motivate you to take the steps necessary to get yourself ready to dive into that place, which is ultimately going to set you free. That was my journey. Again, as we talk about, I wasn't planning to talk about Boundary Bootcamp today, but it really does fit. It's something that it was the thing that motivated me to get out of a very toxic relationship, having been hooked and drawn in large fact to that sort of pacifying story, or the pacifying stories I was telling myself, which was suppressing the fire inside of me. It was minimizing all sorts of horrible shit. It was avoiding having to face the ending of it. It was self-neglect, and it was, it just was not helpful. And I did a lot of, it's interesting at the time, if I think back now, I haven't thought about this, but at the time in that relationship, when I was staying in it way past when I should, a lot of the stuff, the fear around the boundaries, was backed up by a lot of pacifying stories. So watch out for those. So to wrap this up then, I think what I'd love you to take away from this is maybe even if you've heard the idea that your story, creates your reality is impacted by the narrative you tell about it, I hope that you get to have a chance or take a moment to just let that sink in fully. Because I think that's one of the biggest steps you can take, is to really embrace it as a life philosophy, to be much more mindful of the stories you tell, And I think the piece that I really wanted to share, which I think is often missed when that idea is talked about, is it's not a black and white thing. It's not rote positivity. The piece that's often missing is when you find a story, it has to be congruent. It has to connect with you where you are right now in your life, and then be slightly better than the one that's not doing you any favors. And if you work with that principle, if you work with that, then you can begin to build better stories, a more positive spiral about any situation, who you are, and the other people in your life. Basically, noticing where you're stepping more in the victim spectrum and encouraging yourself to move into a story that puts you in an empowered position, in a more empowered role. And remember that sometimes, what seems like a good story might be a pacifying story, and I've not generally found that to be helpful in most life situations. I'm not saying there's never a time when a pacifying story might, for example, save your life in a crunch, but I would moot the point or suggest, I guess what I'm looking for, I would put forward to you that even in those kind of situations, there's a way to tell an empowering story that doesn't deny what's happening, but gives you the best route of being in a physiologically resourced state, which is what having a good story does, mentally, emotionally, physically, to move through it with less damage than with a pacifying story. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, make sure you tell someone about it. And I'll be back next week. We'll be in December. Oh my God. And we'll be coming into the Christmas run. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I have to think about that. Anyway, thanks for being here. As you know, I always appreciate that you come and listen to this show and let me into your ears every week for a half an hour or so. Big hugs, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, I'd love you to do me a solid and tell someone about it. They can find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Plus, if you visit the website www.BABrillianthuman.com, you can share the show notes to social media and make my day. Also, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you haven't yet downloaded the MPA process sheet, head on over to joelyoungmpa.com and get your free copy today. Big love, and see you next time.